The quietest mornings are often the ones that change a neighborhood forever. I didn't know those words would prove true until the soft chime of my phone interrupted an otherwise perfect Saturday. The smell of freshly cut grass drifted through the open kitchen window while sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Somewhere down the street, I could hear the cheerful click of bicycle wheels rolling over the sidewalk, followed by bursts of children's laughter echoing between neat rows of maple trees. It was the kind of peaceful suburban morning every parent hopes their children will remember. My name is Ryan Carter, and until that morning, I believed Willow Creek was exactly that kind of neighborhood. I poured another cup of coffee and stepped onto my front porch just as my 8-year-old son pushed off on his bright blue bicycle, carefully riding along the sidewalk with two friends. They laughed as they tried to race toward the small neighborhood park, slowing whenever they passed someone walking a dog or pushing a stroller. They had learned those habits because every parent on our street had taught them the same thing: slow down, be respectful, and always give pedestrians the right of way. Watching them disappear around the corner brought an easy smile to my face. Then my phone vibrated again. The sender read, Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The subject line immediately tightened the knot in my stomach. Proposed community sidewalk bicycle restriction policy. I opened the email without thinking twice. The words blurred together for a moment before one sentence seemed to leap off the screen. Effective immediately upon board approval, bicycles would no longer be permitted on community sidewalks. Parents were encouraged to direct children to ride only in designated streets or approved recreation areas. I read it again, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. My eyes drifted back toward the sidewalk where only seconds earlier children had been riding without a care in the world. One by one, phones began chiming throughout the neighborhood. Across the street, my neighbor Emily stepped onto her porch with the same stunned expression I must have been wearing. Hey! Father farther down the block lowered his phone and called his daughter back before she reached the corner. The familiar sounds of spinning bicycle tires slowly disappeared. It wasn't because anything dangerous had happened. It was because everyone was reading the same email at nearly the same moment. Within 15 minutes, our neighborhood group chat exploded with confused messages. Some parents were angry. Others simply wanted answers. A few residents wondered whether recent complaints had forced the HOA to act. No one seemed to know where the proposal had come from or why it had appeared so suddenly. As I continued reading, one name appeared beneath the proposal. Patricia Collins, HOA Board President. I had spoken with Patricia before. She was organized, professional, and rarely made emotional decisions. That alone made the proposal even more confusing. There had to be a reason behind it, but banning every child from riding safely on the sidewalks didn't feel like the answer. I looked toward my son's bicycle, now leaning silently against our garage after he had reluctantly wheeled it home. His disappointed expression stayed with me far longer than the email itself. At that moment, I realized this wasn't simply about bicycles. It was about whether one proposal, built on fear or incomplete information, could quietly erase a piece of childhood that had always belonged to our neighborhood. The first thing I learned after reading that HOA proposal was that a single sentence on a page could create 1,000 questions in a neighborhood. By Sunday morning, the sidewalks of Willow Creek felt strangely different. They were still the same concrete paths lined with trees and flower beds, but something had changed. Parents watched their children more closely. Kids rode slower, almost as if they were afraid someone might suddenly tell them they were breaking a rule they never knew existed. I couldn't stop thinking about one question. Why was a complete ban necessary? If safety was the goal, where was the evidence proving that sidewalks had become dangerous? I decided I needed answers before I made any assumptions. That afternoon, I drove to the Willow Creek Clubhouse. The building looked exactly as it always did. Freshly painted walls, clean glass doors, a small community garden near the entrance filled with colorful flowers. Nothing about the place suggested controversy. Yet inside those walls, a decision had already been prepared that could affect hundreds of families. I signed in and requested access to the HOA records available to homeowners. The receptionist handed me several binders and directed me toward a quiet room near the back of the clubhouse. The smell of old paper and printer ink filled the air as I opened the first folder. Meeting minutes, financial reports, safety discussions, policy revisions. I started searching for anything related to bicycles, sidewalks, or accidents. For hours, I turned page after page, highlighting information and writing notes in the margins. What I found surprised me. There were complaints, but not the kind I expected. A few residents had mentioned children riding too quickly near pedestrians. One person reported a child leaving a bicycle near a walkway entrance. Another mentioned occasional noise during afternoon hours. Those concerns were real, but none of them described a neighborhood-wide safety emergency. There were no serious accident reports, no repeated incidents, no data showing that bicycles on sidewalks were creating a widespread danger. The more I researched, the clearer the pattern became. Willow Creek had always handled problems by creating specific solutions. Parking issues resulted in updated parking zones. Landscaping concerns resulted in clearer maintenance rules. Pool safety concerns resulted in better supervision guidelines. The HOA had a history of adjusting policies carefully, not removing privileges entirely. But this proposal was different. It skipped the usual steps. There was no resident survey, no committee review, no trial period, no discussion about safer alternatives. Just a complete restriction. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the pages spread across the table. The problem wasn't that the HOA wanted children to be safe. Every parent wanted that. The problem was that the solution seemed much larger than the problem itself. A rule designed to protect the community should understand the community first. Before leaving the clubhouse, I printed copies of the public documents and organized my notes into a folder. As I walked outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the windows, and I could hear the familiar sound of bicycle wheels moving along the sidewalk again. A group of children was riding carefully near the park entrance, slowing down as an elderly couple passed by. They were doing exactly what everyone wanted them to do. Being responsible, being respectful, being kids. Watching them, I realized I wasn't trying to stop change. Communities need rules. They need safety standards. They need leadership. But they also need decisions based on reality, not assumptions. And if the board meeting was where this decision would be made, then I knew exactly what I needed to bring with me. Not anger, not accusations, but the truth hidden inside those records. The folder on my passenger seat became a reminder that facts alone don't tell the entire story. They reveal what happened, but they don't always explain why it matters. After reviewing the HOA records, I knew the next step wasn't another document. It was the people who lived behind those numbers. I needed to understand what Willow Creek actually felt like before anyone tried to change it. So on Monday morning, I grabbed my notebook, left the folder on my kitchen table, and started walking through the neighborhood. The same sidewalks that had become the center of the controversy looked completely ordinary. Children carried backpacks toward school. Neighbors watered flowers along their driveways. Dogs rested beneath shaded porches. Life continued as if no policy proposal was waiting to reshape everyone's routine. My first stop was the Peterson family's house at the end of Maple Street. Their 9-year-old daughter, Lily, was the first person I saw riding her bicycle that morning. She slowed immediately when she noticed me approaching and politely moved closer to the edge of the sidewalk. Her father, Mark, smiled when he saw my notebook. "I guess you've been looking into the bike rule too," he said. I nodded. He invited me to sit outside, and within minutes, I realized something important. Parents weren't ignoring safety. They were already teaching it. Mark explained that Lily had learned how to ride responsibly from the moment she received her first bicycle. She knew when to slow down, how to pass pedestrians, and why sidewalks were safer than busy streets for younger children. "We don't want unlimited freedom," he told me. "We want reasonable rules that teach responsibility." I wrote that sentence down. It captured exactly what I had been hearing from everyone else. Later that afternoon, I spoke with residents who didn't even have children. I wanted to hear opinions from people who might support the HOA proposal. Mrs. Anderson, a retired teacher who lived near the community park, admitted she had concerns about fast-moving bicycles near walkers. But she surprised me with her solution. "I don't think banning them fixes anything," she said while watching children play nearby. "Teach them where to ride. Teach them how to share the space." Another neighbor, Tom, told me he had originally supported the restriction after hearing rumors about safety issues. But when I asked whether he had seen any serious incidents himself, he paused. He hadn't. Like many people, he had reacted to a fear without having the full picture. By the end of the week, my notebook was filled with conversations from every corner of Willow Creek. Parents wanted safer riding habits. Elderly residents wanted peaceful walking paths. Homeowners without children wanted respect for shared spaces. Everyone agreed on one thing: safety mattered. The disagreement was about how to achieve it. The more people I spoke with, the clearer the solution became. This was never a battle between parents and the HOA. It was a question of whether a community could solve a problem without removing something valuable from the people who lived there. That evening, I sat on my porch watching my son carefully ride his bicycle along the sidewalk. He slowed near a neighbor walking a dog, smiled, and waited until the path was clear before continuing. It was such a small moment, but it represented everything I had discovered. Children could learn responsibility. Communities could create better rules. And sometimes the answer wasn't taking something away. Sometimes the answer was teaching everyone how to share it. I looked down at my notebook filled with names, ideas, and honest conversations. The next step was no longer just proving why the ban was unnecessary. It was building something better that nobody could ignore. The problem with most arguments is that everyone becomes very good at explaining what they don't want, but very few people take the time to build what they actually need. After spending days listening to Willow Creek residents, I realized that simply proving the sidewalk bike ban was unnecessary wouldn't be enough. If I walked into the HOA meeting with only criticism, the board could easily dismiss my concerns as another disagreement. I needed something better. I needed a solution that protected pedestrians, respected parents, and gave children a safe way to enjoy the neighborhood they called home. That weekend, my dining room transformed into a planning room. The familiar smell of coffee mixed with the sound of my laptop keyboard as papers covered nearly every inch of the table. Maps of Willow Creek sat beside resident feedback forms, HOA guidelines, safety recommendations, and notes from conversations with neighbors. My son's blue bicycle rested near the doorway, a quiet reminder of why this mattered. I wasn't trying to preserve a privilege. I was trying to protect a balance. I started creating a proposal called the Neighborhood Safe Riding Program. The first idea was simple: create expectations instead of restrictions. Children could continue riding on sidewalks, but with clear guidelines. Slow-speed areas would be identified near playgrounds, parks, and high-traffic walking zones. Signs would remind riders to slow down and yield to pedestrians. Parents would receive safety information when registering bicycles with the community. The goal wasn't punishment. It was education. I also studied how other neighborhoods handled similar concerns. Several nearby communities had faced conflicts between pedestrians and young riders, but none had chosen a complete ban. Instead, they used solutions that focused on awareness, shared responsibility, and better communication. Their results showed something important. Communities didn't become safer by removing activities. They became safer when people understood how to share spaces. I included those examples in my proposal. Then I added the part one believed mattered most: resident involvement. A volunteer safety committee made up of parents, pedestrians, and other homeowners could review concerns before they became larger conflicts. Instead of waiting until frustration reached the HOA board, residents would have a direct way to discuss problems and create solutions together. By the time I finished the first draft, the document looked nothing like the angry response I originally imagined writing. It wasn't a complaint. It was a plan. The following evening, I met with several neighbors at the community park to review the ideas. Parents suggested adding bike safety events for children. Older residents recommended clearer walking paths near benches and gathering areas. Even residents who had initially supported the restriction found parts of the proposal they appreciated. That moment showed me something important. People weren't divided because they wanted different things. They were divided because they had never been given a chance to create the answer together. Later that night, I placed the final pages into a folder beside the HOA records I had collected earlier. The same folder that started with questions now held a possible solution. I looked out the window and watched my son slowly ride past the house, carefully stopping when a neighbor crossed the sidewalk. That small moment represented everything I hoped the board would understand. Safety and freedom didn't have to compete. With the right approach, they could exist together. And now I was ready to bring that message into the room where the future of Willow Creek would be decided. The Willow Creek clubhouse had never looked more crowded. By the time I arrived for the HOA meeting, every parking space near the entrance was filled, and small groups of neighbors stood outside, talking quietly beneath the warm glow of the evening lights. Some held printed copies of the original Sidewalk. Bike restriction proposal. Others carried notes, questions, and ideas they wanted the board to hear. The same community that had felt uncertain only days earlier was now gathered in one room, ready to decide what kind of neighborhood we wanted to become. I walked through the doors holding my folder tightly against my side. Inside were the documents I had collected, the conversations I had recorded, and the neighborhood safe riding program that represented weeks of listening and preparation. I wasn't walking in to defeat Patricia Collins or challenge the authority of the HOA board. I was walking in because I believed decisions affecting families deserved more than assumptions. The meeting room was already filling when I entered. Parents sat beside residents who had no children. Older homeowners exchanged greetings with young families. The usual distance between neighbors seemed smaller than before. Everyone had a reason for being there. Everyone wanted Willow Creek to remain safe. When Patricia Collins stepped to the front table, the room slowly became silent. She looked calm and professional, just as she always did during HOA meetings. After reviewing the evening's agenda, she introduced the sidewalk bicycle restriction proposal. Patricia explained the board's concerns clearly. She mentioned pedestrian safety, possible accidents, and the responsibility of the HOA to maintain peaceful shared spaces. Her presentation was organized and respectful. There was no anger in her voice. She genuinely believed a restriction was the safest solution. That was what made the conversation important. This wasn't about a villain trying to harm a community. It was about whether a single solution could truly address a complicated problem. When Patricia finished, the floor opened for homeowner comments. Several residents spoke first. Some supported stricter rules because they worried about children riding too quickly near walkers. Others shared concerns about crowded sidewalks during busy hours. Listening to them, I realized their fears were real. Safety mattered to everyone in that room. Then Patricia called my name. I walked toward the microphone carrying my folder. The room became quiet as I placed my documents on the podium. I started with something simple. I told them I agreed that safety had to come first. Then I explained what I had discovered. I showed the board the HOA records, the complaint history, and the lack of serious incidents supporting a complete ban. I shared the conversations I had with parents, retirees, and residents without children. Their opinions were different, but their goal was the same. A safe neighborhood where everyone could share public spaces responsibly. Then I introduced the Neighborhood Safe Riding Program. The presentation showed maps of slower riding zones, safety signs, education programs, and a resident committee designed to address future concerns before they became conflicts. I wasn't asking the HOA to ignore problems. I was asking them to solve those problems accurately. As the final slide appeared, I looked around the room. Parents listened carefully. Older residents nodded slowly. Even Patricia studied the proposal with a different expression than before. For the first time since the email arrived, the discussion no longer felt like a battle between two sides. It felt like a community searching for the right answer together. And I knew the most important part of the night wasn't proving someone wrong. It was proving that Willow Creek was still capable of finding a better way forward. The room remained quiet after my presentation, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that filled the clubhouse when the meeting began. Before, it had been the silence of disagreement. Now, it was the silence of people thinking. I stepped away from the microphone and returned to my seat, watching as residents looked through the information I had presented. The charts were still displayed on the screen. The maps showing proposed safety zones remained visible. The Neighborhood Safe Riding Program was no longer just an idea written on paper. It had become something everyone in the room could imagine becoming real. Then the first homeowner stood up. It was Mrs. Anderson, the retired teacher who had told me she wanted safer sidewalks, but didn't believe banning bicycles was the answer. She walked slowly toward the microphone and looked around the room. "I don't have children riding bikes anymore," she began. "But I remember when my own kids did. The question isn't whether we want safety. We all do. The question is whether we solve problems by teaching responsibility or by removing opportunities." Her words changed the atmosphere instantly. She wasn't defending parents. She wasn't criticizing the board. She was simply reminding everyone that this decision affected more than one group of people. After she returned to her seat, several more residents spoke. A father shared how his son gained confidence by learning to ride independently. An older homeowner explained that he supported clearer rules because he enjoyed walking peacefully through the neighborhood every evening. A resident without children admitted that she originally supported the restriction because she assumed there were serious safety issues, but after seeing the information presented, she believed a balanced approach made more sense. One voice after another added a different perspective. Yet somehow, those different perspectives started creating the same message. Everyone wanted Willow Creek to remain safe. Everyone wanted neighbors to respect each other. The disagreement had never been about the goal. It had been about the method. I looked across the room toward Patricia Collins. She sat quietly at the board table, taking notes as each person spoke. The confident certainty she had shown at the beginning of the meeting had softened into careful consideration. She wasn't defending the original proposal anymore. She was listening to the community it was supposed to serve. After nearly an hour of discussion, Patricia picked up the microphone again. She thanked everyone for sharing their thoughts respectfully and acknowledged that the concerns raised by residents showed how much people cared about Willow Creek. A strong community is not one where everyone agrees immediately, she said. A strong community is one where people can disagree, listen, and still work toward the same goal. Those words stayed with me because they represented exactly what had happened. Nobody had lost. Nobody had been humiliated. The conversation had simply become bigger than the original proposal. The board announced that the decision would be postponed for further review while they considered the alternative program and additional resident feedback. It wasn't the final vote yet, but it was a major shift. The complete ban that once seemed inevitable was no longer the only option on the table. As people began leaving the clubhouse, the energy felt completely different from when we arrived. Neighbors who had walked in on opposite sides of the issue were now discussing possible improvements together. Parents talked with older residents about safety ideas. Board members collected copies of the proposal for further review. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the neighborhood lights slowly turned on along the sidewalks that started this entire conversation. I stood near my truck for a moment, watching families walk home and children carrying their bicycles beside them. The fight was not over yet. But something important had already changed. Willow Creek had stopped asking, who was right, and started asking, how do we make this work for everyone? The following week felt strangely different in Willow Creek. The same sidewalks that had been the center of so much disagreement suddenly felt like shared spaces again. People were still talking about the upcoming HOA decision, but the conversations had changed. The anger that filled neighborhood messages after the original proposal had faded into something more productive. Residents were no longer asking who was winning the argument. They were asking what solution would actually work. I noticed that change everywhere. Parents who once felt defensive were now discussing safety ideas with neighbors who had originally supported the restriction. Older residents who worried about fast-moving bicycles were sharing suggestions about better signs and clearer pathways. The problem hadn't disappeared, but the way we approached it had completely transformed. A few days later, the HOA board scheduled a follow-up meeting to review the revised options. I arrived at the clubhouse with the same folder I had carried before, but it felt different. In my hands. The first time I brought it into that room, it represented a challenge. This time, it represented a possibility. The meeting began with Patricia Collins addressing the residents. She explained that the board had reviewed the additional feedback, studied the neighborhood safe riding program, and considered the concerns raised by both supporters and critics of the original proposal. Her tone was calm, but I could hear something different behind her words. She wasn't defending a decision anymore. She was explaining a process. Patricia acknowledged that the original restriction came from a desire to improve safety, but she also admitted that the board had not fully explored alternative solutions before presenting the ban. It was a small statement, but in an HOA meeting, those words carried weight. Leaders rarely have to admit they could have looked deeper. When they do, people notice. The board then presented the updated plan. The complete sidewalk bicycle restriction was removed. Instead, Willow Creek would introduce a community safety program built around responsibility and awareness. Specific areas near playgrounds and high-traffic walkways would receive additional signs encouraging slower speeds. Children and parents would receive safety guidelines. Residents could report concerns through a clearer process before issues became larger conflicts. A volunteer committee would work with the HOA to review future safety concerns. The room remained quiet as the board prepared for the final vote. I looked around and saw the same people who had entered the first meeting worried and uncertain. But now their expressions were different. There was relief. There was understanding. There was a feeling that everyone had been part of the solution. Patricia called for the vote. One by one, board members raised their hands. The result was unanimous. The neighborhood safe riding program was approved. For a moment, nobody moved. Then applause slowly spread through the room. It wasn't the kind of celebration that came from defeating an opponent. It was the kind that came from finding common ground. I watched parents smile, older residents shake hands, and neighbors who had disagreed only weeks earlier congratulate each other. Walking outside after the meeting, I heard the familiar sound of bicycle wheels moving along the sidewalk. A child slowed down near a family walking their dog, waited patiently, and continued riding after they passed. It was such a simple moment, but it represented everything we had been trying to protect. The goal was never to choose bicycles over safety or safety over childhood memories. The goal was to create a neighborhood where both could exist. As I stood beneath the evening sky, I realized something important. The strongest communities aren't built when everyone thinks the same way. They're built when people are willing to listen long enough to find a better answer together. The weeks after the HOA vote brought a change to Willow Creek that was difficult to measure but impossible to miss. The sidewalks looked the same. The houses still lined the same quiet streets. The oak trees still stretched over the neighborhood paths where families walked every evening. Yet something about the community felt different. It wasn't just that children were riding their bicycles again. It was that neighbors who once stood on opposite sides of an argument were now working toward the same goal. The approval of the neighborhood safe riding program was only the beginning. The real challenge was turning a decision written on paper into something that worked in everyday life. A few days after the vote, Patricia Collins invited residents to the clubhouse for the first planning meeting. When I walked inside, I noticed something immediately. The room looked nothing like the tense meeting where the original ban had been discussed. There were no divided groups sitting on opposite sides. Instead, chairs were arranged in a circle. Parents sat beside retirees. Board members sat beside volunteers. Everyone had a voice. Patricia opened the meeting with a simple message. A good policy isn't just something we approve. It's something we build together. Hearing those words from her was a reminder of how much had changed. Months earlier, the conversation had started with a restriction. Now it was focused on cooperation. Over the next several weeks, the committee worked through every detail of the new program. Residents helped identify areas where additional signs would be most useful. Parents suggested ways to teach younger riders about sidewalk etiquette. Older homeowners provided feedback about walking paths and areas where visibility could be improved. Even small details received attention because everyone understood that safety was created through many small decisions, not one large rule. The first improvement appeared near the community park. New signs reminded bicycle riders to slow down, watch for pedestrians, and share the sidewalk responsibly. The message wasn't threatening. It wasn't about punishment. It was about respect. Another change came through a neighborhood safety event organized by volunteers. Children brought their bicycles while parents and community members helped demonstrate safe riding habits. I watched my son practice stopping at intersections and giving pedestrians enough space to pass. What impressed me most wasn't that the kids were following rules. It was that they understood why those rules existed. They weren't afraid of consequences. They were learning responsibility. During one of the events, I noticed Patricia standing near the edge of the park watching families interact. She wasn't giving instructions or directing the activity. She was simply observing. When she saw me, she smiled and walked over. "I have to admit something," she said. "When we first discussed the restriction, I thought removing the risk was the easiest solution." She looked toward the children riding nearby. "But I realize now that the easiest solution isn't always the best solution." I appreciated her honesty because real change rarely comes from someone admitting they were wrong overnight. It comes from being willing to learn. As summer continued, the new system became part of normal life in Willow Creek. Children rode carefully. Walkers felt respected. Parents felt confident. Problems still happened occasionally, because every community has challenges. But now people had a process to solve them before frustration turned into conflict. Looking back at the first email that started everything, I realized the biggest transformation wasn't about bicycles at all. It was about how a neighborhood responds when faced with disagreement. Willow Creek didn't become stronger because everyone finally agreed. It became stronger because people learned how to disagree while still respecting each other. And that was the kind of change no HOA document could create alone. 6 months after the first HOA email arrived, I stood at the edge of the same sidewalk where this entire story began. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of Willow Creek waking up. Birds moved through the trees above the walking paths. Sprinklers clicked across perfectly maintained lawns. Parents walked beside their children heading toward the neighborhood park. And every few minutes, the quiet sound of bicycle wheels rolling over concrete reminded me how much had changed. My son rode ahead of me on his blue bicycle, wearing the same helmet he had worn before the controversy started. But now there was something different. He wasn't riding with uncertainty or hesitation. He was riding with confidence because he understood how to share the space around him. He slowed when pedestrians crossed. He stopped at corners. He greeted neighbors passing by. The sidewalk that once represented conflict had become a symbol of cooperation. Looking around Willow Creek, it was hard to believe that a single proposal had once created so much tension. The signs placed near busy areas blended naturally into the neighborhood. The safety reminders were no longer viewed as restrictions. They were simply part of how people cared for each other. The volunteer committee continued meeting every month, not because there was a crisis, but because residents had discovered the value of staying involved before problems grew larger. One evening, I attended another community meeting at the clubhouse. This time, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different from that first night. There were fewer worried faces and more familiar conversations. Neighbors laughed together before the meeting started. Parents shared updates about their children's writing progress. Older residents talked about how much they appreciated the improved awareness around walking areas. The biggest change wasn't written in any policy document. It was visible in the way people interacted. Patricia Collins arrived a few minutes before the meeting began. She walked through the room greeting residents by name, something I rarely saw during the early days of the dispute. When she noticed me, she smiled and sat beside me for a moment. "You know," she said, looking toward the windows facing the neighborhood streets. "I used to think strong leadership meant making the decision quickly and protecting everyone from risk." She paused and watched a child slowly ride past the clubhouse outside. "Now I think strong leadership means understanding the people affected by those decisions." I appreciated hearing that because the journey had never been about proving Patricia wrong. It had been about creating a situation where everyone could learn something. The original proposal came from a desire to keep the community safe. The problem was that safety, without understanding, could create unnecessary division. What changed Willow Creek wasn't one person winning an argument. It was hundreds of people choosing to listen. As I walked home that evening, the sunset painted the sidewalks with golden light. A group of children rode bicycles near the park while parents watched from nearby benches. An elderly couple walked comfortably along the same path, smiling as the kids passed carefully beside them. It was an ordinary scene, but after everything that happened, ordinary felt meaningful. I thought back to the morning when my phone first displayed those words, "Proposed Community Sidewalk Bicycle Restriction Policy." At that moment, I believed the fight was about bicycles. I was wrong. The real fight was about whether communities solve problems by removing things or by improving the way people live together. Willow Creek chose improvement. It chose conversation over conflict, responsibility over restriction, and cooperation over division. Because in the end, justice doesn't always arrive with a dramatic victory. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried on the sound of bicycle wheels moving safely down a neighborhood sidewalk, reminding everyone that a community is strongest when every person has a place within it. Justice isn't loud. It's smart, patient, and inevitable.